and start it.
That sounds great. Thank you, Brian, so much. As many of you may have just heard, we are recording this presentation. We will include a link to that recording when we follow up with the materials. We'll also include the slide deck. So no need to furiously take notes. We'll make sure you get all of it at the end. I would love to introduce the two of us. I am Haley Fields. I am a principal of the firm, a consultant here out of our Portland office, and I am the director of vendor services. I lead the team that is responsible for all of our record keeper due diligence, our fee benchmarking that folks who are on the line that are clients of ours will see annually in the second quarter, as well as our RFP and vendor search work. Brian Rollins is here. I will let you introduce yourself, Brian. Go ahead.
No, thank you so much. Brian Rollins, consultant based in Houston, Texas. Have the pleasure of being the furthest east consultant that we have in the firm here in Houston. So happy to share this information with you all today.
Thanks. And before we dive into the meat of the presentation, I do want to talk a little bit about who we are as Multnomah Group for folks who may not be familiar. So we are a full service retirement plan consulting firm, 9 consultants from as far west as Portland, Oregon, and as far east as Houston,
Houston,
Texas.
Texas.
With clients across the country from Hawaii to New York. We serve about 31 billion in assets under management that's split across 166 or so clients. And we, of course, do investment recommendations, but also, I think, critically help our clients with their governance, their committee services, and their vendor due diligence and monitoring. Vendors are the face of the retirement benefit to participants and a really critical partner to the successful running of a plan. And we are here today to talk through how you should be thinking about that relationship and getting the most out of it. So this deck, again, for folks who are clients, may have already seen this. We have put together a fiduciary training program to help ensure that our clients and the committees that we work with are educated and fully aware of their roles and responsibilities as it relates to being fiduciaries to the plan. We do that for 2 reasons. One, the Department of Labor requires that employers educate committee members on their roles and responsibilities. Being a fiduciary to a benefit plan is an important role, and you need to be aware of what those responsibilities are as a fiduciary. The second reason, maybe more fun, is that we think that committees who understand the operations of the plan and what they are responsible for make better decisions and make better informed decisions. So one of the key reasons we do this is to make sure that everyone who comes from a wide array of knowledge bases and roles has a level playing field when it comes to making decisions related to the plan.
No, definitely. And as we kind of jump into a few of the slides, really wanted to give you all some perspective on knowing when to hire a service provider, but also following a process, a prudent process when hiring a service provider. So at Multnomah Group, one thing that we really focus our attention on is making sure that when we're documenting and producing materials, that there's always a process in play. And that includes when you're hiring a service provider or even considering what a service provider may be able to do for your organization. So for example, the first thing you might do is gather that relevant information. You want to review exactly what's needed as far as your firm is, your organization is concerned. During that time, you might be soliciting proposals. You'll be getting information from individuals, whether that be a record keeper, an attorney, an auditor, a variety of things that may be required to make sure that your plan runs smoothly. The first thing we want to do is gather some of that relevant information. The second piece would be analyzing that information. Obviously, you're going to collect a lot. In that process of collection, that next step would be making sure you analyze that information to understand what these service providers are able to do. You'll also at that moment start to look at fee reasonableness, and we'll talk about that in a moment when we talk about fees later on here in the presentation. But you'll go through your analyzation phase, and then from there, you'll want to make a decision. You'll meet with those individuals who may have some decision-making authority within your organization. It might be amongst your committee. It might go back to a board. It might be at a higher level in the organization, but you'll review each one of those organizations that you gathered details on, those proposals, all the information that you analyzed, and then you'll make a decision based on the merits of each of these service providers' proposals. And then lastly, and probably one thing that we'll talk about often during this presentation, we talk about it often with the clients that we work with, we want to document that process. Retaining a fiduciary file, whether that be in meeting minutes, material reviewed, whether it's a scorecard, score sheet, whatever those documents are, we want to document that process. And guess what? You might end up doing this same process all over again. We don't think a prudent process happens one time. That should be embedded in your organization, embedded in how you run and manage the organization's retirement program, as well as your fiduciary file. So again, we'll be gathering that information, analyzing, making a decision, and then all the while we'll be documenting that process. So keep that in mind as we go through the presentation on how you might be able to, include that as a part of your process. On here, knowing when to hire becomes one of those challenges because everyone doesn't always have the expertise to understand exactly what's needed. There's a lot of fiduciary responsibility. If you can imagine some of the things that have just recently came out, and I'll just give you an example of some of the stuff that we talk about here every day. Of course, we had Secure Act. We went from Secure Act to the CARES Act once we had COVID-19 and the pandemic. From the CARES Act, we have Secure Act 2.0. And not to mention some of the day-to-day concerns or challenges that may come up, just being a retirement plan sponsor. There's a lot of things that may happen. And as a fiduciary, you may not be able to handle all those. We know you have competing priorities. There are a number of other things that happen in your organization. So being able to hire for fiduciary functions where a committee lacks expertise is really a place that we focus a lot of our attention on during this presentation. Some of the questions we've got here is, has the committee been delegated authority to hire a third-party service provider? You might have a board or an organization that has a CFO or a CEO suite that delegates down the authority to the committee to allow that decision to hire a service provider. Does the committee lack expertise? Is the committee embedded in the weeds on, to Haley's earlier point, investment recommendations or investment review or service provider review? Are they able to make a determination between record keeper X and record keeper Y? Does the committee lack that full expertise there? Is there a service provider qualified in the identified function? Depending upon what the needs are for the organization, does the service provider qualified? Are you able to find someone that can meet those needs there? And then the couple other pieces here, and I'm gonna pivot here one moment. How will they be compensated? One, will that be paid by the organization, by plan participants, or will there be any conflict of interest? And that's a question that may relate to, are there other relationships or details where you work with them? Are there any shareholder concerns, different things like that that may impact the ability of that service provider to provide a service for you without a conflict of interest? And then lastly, what responsibilities remain after hiring a service provider? For example, at the minimum, you must monitor the service provider that you hire. People think once you hire someone and they're doing a good job for you, you never have to check in with those individuals, but you definitely need to be monitoring those service providers as a part of that process. Again, that prudent process, documenting, making sure you understand what's happening, monitoring that service provider would be a part of that process. So Haley, I want to throw a question to you here from this slide. What kind of questions should people be asking themselves deciding if they would like to hire a service provider and not on their plan?
Yeah, that's a really wonderful question. I mean, there's many. I think the ones outlined on this slide are a really good start. I think what plan sponsors should also think about is, even if you have perhaps the expertise to fulfill one of these roles, maybe you have internal counsel that could, advise you on the plan along with their other duties. Do they have the time for that? Do they have the resources to do that effectively with the, other parts of their job? So not only do you have the expertise, but does it make sense to do this internally, or does it make sense to outsource that responsibility? We've also seen a real proliferation in the kinds of activities that a record keeper will do for a plan sponsor. And so which of these items make sense to handle internally, which makes sense to make sure that your payroll provider or your HRIS provider handles, and what makes sense to have maybe a record keeper, a third party administrator, someone else handle. So really think about what will be the most effective use of your resources. And sometimes, as the saying goes, the cheapest way to pay for something is with money. So really consider where you want to outsource and what you can effectively outsource, because again, you can give duties to other providers, but you do still need to monitor them. And so make sure that you really understand what they're doing, what they're charged with, so we're not duplicating any efforts.
No, definitely, definitely.
Brian, maybe you walk us through the kinds of providers we typically see our clients utilize. Certainly, investment consultants, anyone that's a client of ours has hired an investment consultant.
Yeah, definitely. So we've got slide 7 here that really gives you an idea of your typical providers. But let's really start at the top, because you'll have your plan sponsor. Really that's your organization who's sponsoring the retirement plan on behalf of the participants, who will, of course, have a great experience as it relates to hopefully being able to retire with dignity. And then that plan sponsor will delegate responsibility often to a committee. That committee may be a small group of individuals who assist in making decisions, everything from investment recommendations all the way down to, hey, how our service providers are going to be paid, fees, et cetera. That committee will be having that day-to-day or quarterly conversation around what the plan sponsor has delegated authority for. And then there are typical providers that we would see and that we interact with on a day-to-day basis. Of course, investment consultants. That's what we do. Haley gave you some thoughts on our process and what that looks like. But you also may interact with an attorney. An attorney oftentimes may assist with plan document preparation, helping you with some of those sticky issues that may come up if someone has a claim to benefits or a right that they feel like needs to be looked at. The attorney can support you and make sure that you all have that documented in a process that's done in a legal fashion. Now, your auditor is separate. That's that checks and balances pieces. You might have a auditor firm come in and be able to not only look at the process of your plan, the internal controls, also look at the costs of your investments to just ensure that all those details are lined out and that you're following the information that you would say, whether it be in your governance documents or how the plan runs. Obviously, we talked investment consultant, but then lastly, one piece that many of you probably interact with quite a bit would be your record keeper, third-party administrator, or your custodian. Of course, custodian being the place where your assets are held. Oftentimes, it is the exact same as your record keeper. So some of you may be familiar with your organization that you're sharing those contributions to, where employees are deferring to, but at the same time, they may also provide education, or they may provide investment advice for participants with your plan. So these 4 here provide pretty much a lot of the opportunity for a hiring of a service provider when you're looking at your organization overall. Now, there can be some overlapping roles to this. So Haley, where do you see some of the overlapping roles the most with these organizations?
Yeah, it's a good question, because you certainly don't need to always have each one of these providers available to you. And you can occasionally use one provider to cover some of the services that another would. An investment consultant's never going to give you legal advice. We're never going to audit the plan, but each of those providers may, give the committee some education. Multnomah Group may be occasionally involved in reviewing plan design structures and plan document reviews, but that's also likely a place where your record keeper is involved. Many of our clients utilize the document of their record keeper and have it reviewed by their ERISA counsel, for example. Auditors are really great about providing regulatory updates. What is the IRS looking at? What is the Department of Labor looking at? But you can also often get that from some of the other providers. This is why I think it's really critical for these providers to work together, to again understand who is responsible for what, to make sure that everyone is speaking to each other and that communication is happening, but also that we're not overlapping services and increasing costs to the plan. We'll talk again about costs in a little bit, but we want to make sure, again, we're being as efficient as possible with the time and resources available. I think it may also be and maybe illustrative, Brian, if we can talk about maybe circumstances we've seen clients utilize a variety of service providers. So I know I have a story, I'm happy to tell it, but Brian, you have a story of a client sort of working through a variety of service providers to solve a problem?
Yeah, definitely. And we'll jump back and forth between the two. So oftentimes what I'll see is you might have a record keeper that provides quite a bit of information as it relates to the plan document service or plan design, and making sure that they can benchmark or determine maybe the best case scenario for a plan of similar size, of similar type, because they have similar plans in their organization. So let's say it's a manufacturing organization, they work with record keeper X. Manufacturing organization may ask record keeper to provide them some details on plan design. How much contributions should they be providing? Details related to that. But also at the same time, they may work in tandem with a legal counsel. And that legal counsel may come in and say, well, let me review and make sure that this works with the structure of our organization, how we're set up to make sure that we're not inhibiting, to make sure that our plan runs compliantly, of course. And then at the same time, putting ourselves in a situation where we're not doing things correctly to the IRS or the Department of Labor. So those two can work hand in hand in making sure that you get a great outcome for your participants. How about yourself?
Yeah, I mean, we see it all the time. Recently I worked with a client who had their payroll manager go out on parental leave. Wonderful, wonderful. But in that person's absence, a couple of the key details of getting the contributions from payroll to the record keeper were missed, and it resulted in some late contributions. I think everyone that it works with a plan listening today knows that that's a big no-no. So the question becomes, okay, we've discovered this was an issue. How do we get it fixed? And that takes a lot of different folks to make sure that it gets resolved correctly. So certainly they needed to understand the record keeper's process for getting that money back into participants' accounts. They also went to ERISA counsel to understand what kind of risks this opened them up to, and then the best and most efficient way to correct that issue. So they, reviewed all of the payroll files, understood, exactly how long folks were out of the market and how to calculate the lost earnings that they should put into the plan. So that took, again, Multnomah Group to work with the client to make sure that they understood what the problem was and how to get help. Certainly their ERISA counsel to provide that legal opinion. I can tell you what I've seen other clients do, but I can't provide you legal advice.
Definitely.
So you need ERISA counsel for that. And then the record keeper to make sure that it is completed correctly, that the money goes where it needs to go, and that if participants have questions, they can get those answered and understand exactly what happened and why $3.40 showed up into my account randomly. So again, it took the whole group to get it done, and it also took everyone knowing what the other parties were doing to end up with a good response. And we did, and the client moved on, and at their next audit, they had a nice memo drafted of exactly what happened. And so their auditor was clear and we could move on. So again, using everybody's expertise to get the job done.
No, definitely. And maybe one last thing before we
Yeah.
go to the next slide. We have the area there where it talks about governance documents, IPS, and charter. And I just want to go back to the initial part of the conversation where we set up that prudent process, making sure that we're documenting, analyzing, meeting, making decisions. And a part of that oftentimes is housed the process, how it will be done, what decisions will be made, are housed in that governance document process. So that investment policy statement or a charter that guides the committee. Oftentimes an investment consultant and that attorney might work hand in hand and making sure that everything that you want as it relates to the fully functionality of your committee and how the committee will react with and interact with the plan can be done there between the investment consultant and the attorney. And that's that charter document and that investment policy statement document. So just want to add that in there because I know several times there are plans that may not even have those documents. And this is a way that you can get a good starter point to make sure that your plan is running compliantly and in guidelines with not only what an attorney would say, but also potentially an investment consultant.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right. So here on slide 9, this is just to talk about some of the value. We know that if you're joining this webinar, that you're probably considering or even looking at potentially how could a service provider provide some value to not only myself, but the participants within the plan. And you'll see here, of course, an attorney, as we've been talking, both Haley and I, is going to support your committee. It's going to ensure that you're compliant. It's going to ensure that you're running smoothly as far as with legal and regulatory obligations. As we started the presentation, we talked about a number of things that are happening at the legislative level that directly impact what's happening with your plans. So an attorney can assist with making sure that things are done legally and done in a compliant regulatory manner. Your auditor, again, they'll fulfill that plan's financial integrity. Of course, we understand that there's obligations under ERISA, and even if you're a non-ERISA plan, we encourage plans to follow those guidelines because those guidelines will make sure that you have a well-run plan that has its financial integrity in place. And it'll also help you detect any operational deficiencies. So if you're saying doing X, but Y is happening, the auditor will be able to find those things and make sure that we get those in line. As Haley mentioned in her previous commentary that, hey, there will be a nice memo. That memo will be written in a way that lets people know that we've worked through that process. And then the last two, investment consultant, of course, we support committees, help committees monitor not only their vendors, but also the investment process. We're going to research and monitor investment managers, and then maybe assist with some menu design to promote participant decision making. One thing that we really focus on is looking at, behavioral finance. Behavioral finance says that participants sometimes can be crippled with the amount of choices or the amount of optionality that they have. So we want to make sure that we're designing menus in a way that not only fits your organization, but fits the way participants may look at how investments are done. Everyone doesn't come to the space with years of investment experience. So we want to make sure that we make that as easy as possible. And then lastly, that record keeper and custodian, they'll administer the plan in accordance with the plan document. They're that first line for you. They're going to assist you with that as you make that plan sponsor direction. They'll help the participants making good decisions. Record keepers do a great job at educating and advising the participants when they contact them as it relates to the funds within their menu. And then lastly, they serve as an extension of the staff. So they're able to field some of those questions that you all may not be able to have the time, bandwidth, or knowledge to field internally. And then they'll also support, as we mentioned here, a well-run benefits program. So many value adds to having service providers. But again, make sure we're monitoring those service providers, having a prudent process as we make the decision on knowing who we might want to hire. So before I kick it back to you, Haley, I did want to talk about, we've mentioned fees here a few times, and I'm a lob a question your way here in one moment, but the payment of service providers, that is a decision that needs to be made. Will that come from plan assets? For example, is that paid by what the participants are doing? Or will it be by company assets or organization assets where it's not connected at all to participant accounts? Plan assets, for example, need to be exclusively used for providing benefits to participants and their beneficiaries. So you might have individuals who have had an account, their beneficiary now has access to that. So all of the details that if it's being paid by the plan assets need to be in benefit of not only the participants, but also their beneficiaries. And committees are permitted to pay reasonable expenses. There's that word again, that reasonable expenses from the plan, and that's in ERISA section 404. And there are penalties, we have to say this, for breaching this duty up to plan disqualification. So if there appears to be, that's where that auditor may be able to come in and support to make sure that you're doing things in a regulatory and compliant manner, because the last thing you would want to be in a space where your plan could be disqualified. Committees, as Haley mentioned before, are not required to purchase services from the lowest cost provider. Just because it's the lowest cost doesn't mean it's going to be the best. But you must be able to demonstrate through a process, again, that prudent process that we've talked about several times throughout the presentation today, that those fees are reasonable. And you'll get through that from, hey, we're going to solicit proposals, we're going to analyze those proposals, we'll meet and make a decision, and then all the while we'll document that process. So as I mentioned before, you can't get away from the process during this, because that's the way you'll be able to show that you've been able to document that information for ERISA. And then lastly, document rationale if you plan to use plan assets. Is it for reasonable expenses? Is it exclusively for the benefit of plan participants and their beneficiaries? And if you're able to demonstrate those things, then no issue there documenting that rationale. So what are the disclosures? What will you see? Any service provider who expects to receive more than $1,000 in compensation is required to provide a fee disclosure. And the covered service providers must provide an initial disclosure to fiduciaries at the time of a new contract. So that disclosure may include services, the description of what they provide for you all, fiduciary status, are they acting as a fiduciary on behalf of your plan, and then the compensation that they were to receive. Service providers will need to provide these disclosures, and that new disclosure is provided at any time there's an update. And this is something that we often talk about, because you might have had something from 3-4 years ago, but you've had several changes and a new disclosure has not been shared or not been sent. So anytime services have changed, whether that's a record keeper, an auditor, an attorney, et cetera, if the service has changed, a fee disclosure is required. If fees have changed, if there has been a reduction or fees have been raised, whatever the situation may be, a fee disclosure is required. And then also if the fiduciary status changes, if they go from being a fiduciary on the plan to not, or vice versa, you definitely would be required to give a new service provider disclosure on behalf of the plan to make sure that you're staying in compliance there. So, Haley, one thing that we do at Multnomah Group is our fee benchmarking. What does that process look like, and could you give us some more details there?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So we believe that, the best way to monitor fees and services, well, the very best way is to do a competitive search, but it's a big undertaking. It's not something a plan is going to do every year, certainly. The next best thing is to do a benchmarking of fees. So we do an annual benchmarking of fees for our clients, typically in the second quarter. So again, for most of the folks listening that are clients of Multnomah Group, it'll be at the next meeting. And what we're trying to do there is to compare the fees that a plan pays to what we would expect to see as bids if you were to go to market. We're not trying to compare to average plan fees. We're not using, the 401k book of averages to try and figure out those numbers. We're using our experience in search work and with other clients and in conversations with record keepers to estimate what we think a plan of your size would pay in fees. We are utilizing those 408b2 disclosures to understand all of the fees that the plan is paying to a record keeper. So we request the fee disclosures each year and review them internally. We also request other data, so number of participants, information about some of those ancillary services we'll talk about in a little bit. But we're getting a whole host of data on all of our clients at the beginning of each year, analyzing it, putting it together, and creating reports for our clients to review. The two levers for record keeper pricing are really the number of participants in the plan and the average account balance. Those are the two numbers that we are typically seeing record keepers utilize when they're pricing plans. So as average account balance is up, typically fees come down. And as the number of participants goes up, we typically see the average cost per participant come down, but certainly the total dollar amount go up. There are some costs associated with just the administration of additional accounts. So that's what we are looking at. We will review that with committees and then talk about the fees along with the services received. Breon mentioned you don't have to go with the cheapest cost available. You do not have to go for the bottom of the barrel pricing quote that you receive if you go out to search, but you want to make sure that the services you receive are in line with the fees that you're paying. So if you want a higher touch, more robust service offering and pay a little bit more for that, wonderful. So we will discuss with our clients the kind of service that they're receiving, compare it to what we've seen that record keeper provide to other clients of ours, or what we've seen other record keepers provide to similar clients, and make sure that we think that that is all aligned. And if it's not aligned, let's renegotiate either services or fees. And if that negotiation doesn't go well, and that's rare, but it certainly happens, next steps are, maybe it's time to actually do that search. Maybe we need to terminate this service provider if we can't come to an agreement on services and fees. That's part of the monitoring process. Firing a record keeper is a little bit like going through a divorce. I think, avoid it if we can, but we want to make sure we're in the best possible situation for participants. And we want to document that we've gone through this process and really discussed it, and feel comfortable with the fees that are being paid and the services that are being received. So a search is, I want to say, a last resort because it is part of a prudent process, but we know we're not doing that every year. We want to make sure we're utilizing other techniques in the meantime between regular searches.
No, definitely, definitely. And it's always an interesting process as you get a chance to deep dive on what's being paid, how it's being paid, et cetera. It really opens you up to what also may be out there in the marketplace. So doing this process on an annual basis definitely supports making sure that committees have that regular review of their service provider and fees. All right.
Do you want me to talk a little bit about fee compression,
Yeah.
Brianne? Yeah. So as I mentioned, depending on plan size, you'll see different fees, you'll see different services, but we have, broadly speaking, seen record keeping fees go down and margins compress, and plans are paying less and less for record keeping each year. And I don't think that it's maybe perhaps begun to slow down, but we're certainly not at the end of that compression. These large financial institutions still, are profit generating entities. They want to make money. So they are looking for other ways to make margin and make money from their relationships with these plans. And so we've seen a handful of really common additional revenue sources for these large financial institutions. So we often see proprietary investment management. So record keepers, your Vanguards, your Fidelities, your Schwabs, the others of the world, do record keeping, but they also have their own investment products that you can make available in the plan. Managed accounts, which are that robo-advisor, so a participant opts in and they give whoever information about their goals and their timeline and their outside assets and all those kinds of good details, and then get a recommended allocation, and the robo-advisor will manage and make trades for their portfolio moving forward. That comes at a cost to participants, and often it has, frankly, really good margins. The cost of building out that managed account is really a one-time fee of building the process, and then each additional individual invested is additional margin. Another common one we see is IRA rollovers. Again, many of these record keepers also provide retail IRA solutions for the general public. And, maybe if you have a good relationship as a participant with the record keeper, you may want to keep your assets there out of the plan, but in with that record keeper if you've received good services. And the last two are harder to calculate, I think, but we are seeing become more and more common, and that's cross-selling retail financial products and selling annuities and annuitization, or lifetime income, whatever you'd like to call it. Because again, these large financial institutions have retail products and retail services available, and they have built a relationship with these participants through being in the plan, and can occasionally use that as an opportunity to sell other services. I don't think any of these in a vacuum are negatives or things that we need to permanently avoid, but you do want to make sure that you understand the full scope of the financial relationship between the record keeper and the plan, and understand and manage how these services are potentially sold to participants, and make sure that you don't feel like there is a conflict of interest. We're trying to avoid conflicts with the people interacting with participants, and make sure that we really understand what this structure looks like. And if we're not comfortable, then again, negotiate to a service level that the plan sponsor is comfortable with. Brianne, have you seen any of these? How have you talked to clients about managing these kinds of other revenue sources?
Yeah, no, great question. And of course, we've seen them all. We've seen everyone. So, but one that I'll spend just a little time with would be around the IRA rollovers. Of course, if you are working in the plan, there's typically a small sum that if you have an employee who's been with the organization for a short bit of time, less than 7,000 now is a threshold that you have with the Secure Act 2.0. Those individuals may just roll themselves out the plan or be cashed out the plan. But oftentimes, your record keeper is also in first position for individuals who have much larger balances that they would love to roll right over into a retail account. Typically, between your investment consultant or work that you've done internally, you have institutional pricing on the investments that are within your investment menu and within your plan. But when that participant rolls out, for example, often plans, they're not making you leave. Let's say you've got a $500,000 balance. They're not saying, hey, just leave, take that balance as soon as you go. Sometimes you can keep that in the plan if you're, still with the organization or looking at different opportunities. But what the IRA rollover process may do, they're in first position to immediately start to market to that individual, to have them take it out of the institutional share class prices into the more retail prices, as Haley mentioned. So that's one that we always like to look at to see, hey, how much of those dollars have actually left the plan, where we know that participants may be paying more than what they would have had they stayed in the plan. And often it happens with your beneficiaries. Not necessarily the individuals who have left and went to other organizations, where we know they may be rolling it into a new employee sponsored plan. It often happens with beneficiaries who might be in a better position versus rolling those assets. So that's something we always like to look at, and common things that we would see on the IRA rollover side.
Yep. And in our fee benchmarking, clients will likely remember this, but we try and capture some of this information. So we'll provide the percentage of assets that are in proprietary investments. We provide the assets, participants, and fees paid for managed accounts, the assets rolled over into a proprietary IRA, and where applicable, the number of participants and the balances that have been annuitized out of the plan. As cross-selling retail financial products is
That's
difficult
tough.
for us to capture, because it typically happens outside the plan, right? If someone opens a bank account with the same provider as the record keeping plan, there's no way for us to take a look at that, unfortunately.
No, definitely, definitely. And a number of the organizations are insurance companies also. So you never know. There might be a life policy or things like that that end up happening, and those are definitely more difficult to capture. Sure.
Absolutely. Yep.
Okay. All right. So we've kind of ended our prepared remarks. Haley, any thoughts on what maybe they should take from today?
Yeah, so I think we've outlined maybe what feels like a lot on the monitoring and managing of service providers. So a couple of things that I want to highlight. One is that Multnomah Group is here and happy to help you with some of that monitoring and managing process, again, through our fee benchmarking, but also through just our work with committees. We're certainly here and happy to help you make sure that you are getting the very best out of your service providers, and especially your record keeper, who plays such a critically important role in the managing of your retirement benefit. If you're here today, it's maybe because you're interested in hiring a service provider or maybe going through a search. So I do want to include, when we send out our materials, we'll include a white paper on what we think are best practices for running a search. And that's also a service that we can provide as a project to clients, or folks that are not clients but are interested in doing a search. So if you're interested in that, want more details, please feel free to reach out to us. I think the other thing that we can offer non-clients. If you're interested and you want us to run a benchmarking of your fees, that's a project that we're also happy to do. So again, feel free to reach out to myself or Breon or any other multnombre group consultant, and we are happy to help you in that as a hopefully trusted partner to the plan sponsor and committees.
No, definitely. And as Haley mentioned, I did want to share that, of course, when we share out the materials, you will get this information as a resource, just conducting a retirement plan, record keeping vendor search, what the benefits are, and then what some of the best practices would be. Again, it's all about that prudent process. And we document what that prudent process will look like here, and also what some of the benefits may be able to attain as a plan sponsor in looking at this process. So we did want to leave some time for questions. We figured we had about 45 minutes or so of prepared remarks. So we'll pause there to see if there are any questions on the material today.
So we
Okay,
do.
so we do
Yeah,
have
go ahead,
one.
Brianne.
Okay, so Haley, maybe I'll throw it to you. It says, do we need to have both an investment policy statement and charter?
It's a great question. So legally, neither are required. We think having both is best practice. I would say, from our perspective, what we typically hear from clients and from their fiduciary liability insurance underwriters is that that investment policy statement is really critical. That's where we are typically seeing the most litigation risk is around the monitoring and managing of the investments and the fees. And so that investment policy statement, which outlines exactly how you're monitoring those investments and making changes, is really, really critical. So I think every client should have both, but if you're going to only have one, then I think that investment policy statement is probably where we'd lean. And
Yeah,
again, go ahead.
No, I was going to say completely agree, especially when you're looking at the fiduciary liability insurance, or then also just what your auditors will be reviewing as well. Having that investment policy statement that can align with what's happening with decisions that are made as it relates to the investments and how the committee monitors and reviews those details definitely supports you. But I would definitely say both as well would probably be best practice there.
Yep.
Okay, we've got another one. As best practice, how often would Multnomah perform a record keeper RFP? Even if you intend not to make a change. I've heard 3, 5 years from other sources. And since we have our director of vendor services on, Haley, I'll let you start with that one. What would your
Yeah.
thoughts be?
Yeah, thank you. That's great. Yeah, I've also heard 3 to 5. I would say that I think 5 years is probably the sweet spot, but because these are relatively large undertakings, I think that fiduciary committees should start talking about the timing of that at 3 years. It's going to take some coordination to make sure you've got the resources available internally to get that done. But also, I think, many of our clients do it less frequently. I think if you've hit the 10-year mark and you haven't done a competitive search, then it's really becomes what I think is a priority from a risk mitigation perspective. But yeah, I think talking about it, making sure that it's on the roadmap at the 3 to 5 year mark is really critical. We also, certainly know there are plans that have never done a search.
Yes.
And so I think that, again, those folks should really think about ways they can reduce any risk posed by having never done a search. And again, reach out to Multnomah Group if that's something you're interested in doing.
No, you hit the exactly what I was going to say at the end. I know that I've encountered a number of plans that have never done a search.
Mm-hmm.
They had set up their retirement plan at some point at start of their organization or when they were eligible to start a plan, and they've never done anything since then. So if that's the case, then we would encourage to Haley's point, you might want to get down that path. But yeah, I would completely agree with her comments there.
Yeah. And a search doesn't require you to move exactly as that says. You are evaluating the fees and the services, and it's a point of leverage with your record keeping vendor. If those negotiations have not been, favorable, let's do a competitive search and have the most leverage to again negotiate those items.
Now we know many of you may have a question or something's going to pop into your mind once you get the materials back. Again, we are open, available if you want to ask any additional details or find some time where we can have a discussion. We are open to that, and we appreciate everyone joining. I'm not seeing any other open questions right now, so Haley, I think we might be good to close it out today.
Wonderful. Yes, I will echo Breon. Thanks everyone for your time today. Please reach out to us if you've got questions or want to chat. We are here to help.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you all so much. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Yep. Have a good one. Bye-bye.